The chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as thunder rolled through the Seattle sky. Inside the towering glass penthouse that overlooked Elliott Bay, something was about to happen that would change two lives forever. Sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives become the very foundations upon which our greatest victories are built. Power has a strange way of revealing who we truly are beneath the surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Some people use their influence to build bridges, to lift others up, to create something beautiful in this world. Others use it like a weapon, cutting down anyone they perceive as beneath them, never realizing that the very people they step on might one day rise to heights they never imagined possible. Victoria Sterling was exactly that kind of person. At 38 years old, she commanded a real estate empire worth over $200 million. Her perfectly styled auburn hair never had a strand out of place, and her emerald eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had forgotten what it meant to see other human beings as anything more than chess pieces on her board of ambition. She wore her success like armor, each designer piece carefully chosen to remind everyone around her that she had climbed to the top and intended to stay there. But success built on cruelty has a way of crumbling when you least expect it. Victoria had built her empire by stepping on anyone who got in her way, and she had grown comfortable in the belief that her wealth made her untouchable. She lived in a world where money could solve any problem, silence any critic, and buy any loyalty she needed. Her penthouse was a testament to her success. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city she had conquered through shrewd business deals and ruthless negotiations. Italian marble covered the floors, and priceless artwork adorned the walls. Everything in her world sparkled and gleamed, perfectly arranged to display her power. But all that perfection couldn't hide the emptiness that had settled deep in her heart, though she would never admit it existed. Standing in the kitchen that evening, wearing a simple black uniform that had seen better days, was Maria Rodriguez. At 26, Maria carried herself with a quiet dignity that no amount of mistreatment could break. Her dark eyes held stories of struggle and sacrifice, but also an unshakable determination that burned bright despite the circumstances that had brought her to this place. Maria had been working for Victoria for 8 months, and every single day had been a test of her patience and resolve. She had taken the job not because she wanted to clean toilets and scrub floors for someone who treated her like she was invisible, but because she had no other choice. Life had dealt her a hand that required her to swallow her pride and do whatever it took to survive. The job had been her only option after her previous employer had to let her go due to budget cuts. Maria had a younger brother, Carlos, who was studying engineering at the University of Washington. Their parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, leaving Maria to raise her 17-year-old brother on her own. Every dollar she earned went toward his tuition, his books, his future. She worked 16-hour days, taking care of Victoria's penthouse during the day and cleaning office buildings at night, also Carlos could have the education that would lift their family out of poverty. Maria had learned to make herself small in Victoria's presence, to move quietly through the rooms, to complete her tasks without drawing attention. Victoria had made it clear from the very first day that she considered domestic help to be nothing more than living furniture, expected to be present when needed and invisible otherwise. The woman had never once asked Maria her name properly, usually calling her girl or the help or simply snapping her fingers when she needed something. But Maria endured it all because she had a dream that kept her going. Every night, as she counted the money she had saved, she imagined the day when Carlos would graduate and become an engineer. She pictured him in his cap and gown, holding his diploma, knowing that all her sacrifices had been worth it. That dream gave her the strength to wake up every morning and face another day of Victoria's cruelty. Victoria's friends were just as cruel as she was, maybe worse because they found entertainment in watching her mistreat the staff. They would gather in the penthouse for their weekly dinner parties, dressed in clothes that cost more than Maria made in 6 months, laughing at jokes that weren't funny and competing to see who could be the most dismissive of the people who served them. These women had grown up with money, married money, or inherited money, and they had never known what it felt like to worry about paying rent or choosing between buying groceries and keeping the electricity on. They lived in a bubble of privilege that protected them from understanding the real world, and they seemed to take pleasure in reminding others of their superior position. Amanda Brooks, Victoria's closest friend, was particularly vicious. She had a way of looking at Maria that made her skin crawl, as if she were examining something unpleasant that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. Amanda would deliberately spill wine on freshly cleaned surfaces just to watch Maria scramble to clean it up again, smirking as she did it. Catherine Wells was quieter in her cruelty but no less effective. She would leave messes in the bathroom that no decent human being should have to clean, and then complain loudly to Victoria about the standards of domestic help these days. She acted as if Maria couldn't hear her speaking, as if servants were deaf as well as invisible. Sarah Mitchell rounded out the trio with her particular brand of psychological torture. She would ask Maria personal questions designed to embarrass her, wanting to know details about her financial situation, her living conditions, her family. When Maria tried to answer politely, Sarah would cut her off with dismissive laughter, making it clear that she didn't actually care about the answers but simply enjoyed making Maria uncomfortable. Victoria encouraged all of this behavior because it fed her own sense of superiority. She would watch her friends humiliate Maria and feel a twisted satisfaction that she had the power to allow it to happen. In her mind, this was simply the natural order of things. Some people were born to rule, and others were born to serve. She had never questioned this belief because it had always worked in her favor. The penthouse itself seemed designed to emphasize the distance between Victoria's world and Maria's reality. The main living area was larger than most apartments, with seating arranged in conversation areas that cost more than a car. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern design, with professional-grade appliances that Maria was barely allowed to touch except when cleaning them. Victoria's bedroom was a suite that included a sitting area, a walk-in closet the size of a small store, and a bathroom with a view of the city that took your breath away. Maria's world within that space was limited to the utility closet where cleaning supplies were kept, the small bathroom reserved for staff, and whatever room she happened to be cleaning at any given moment. She was not allowed to sit on the furniture, not allowed to use the main bathroom, not allowed to eat any of the food in the refrigerator. Victoria had made these rules clear on her first day, delivering them with the same tone she might use to explain how to operate the vacuum cleaner. The contrast between their lives was stark and deliberate. Victoria would spend more on a single dinner with her friends than Maria made in a month. Victoria's morning routine involved a personal trainer, a massage therapist, and a stylist who came to the penthouse to ensure she looked perfect before leaving for her office. Maria's morning routine involved getting up at 5 a.m. to clean 2 office buildings before arriving at the penthouse by 8 to begin her day there. Victoria's calendar was filled with business lunches, charity galas, and social events where she networked with other wealthy and powerful people. Maria's calendar was filled with work, more work, and the precious few hours each week when she could call Carlos to check on his studies and make sure he was staying focused on his goals. The city of Seattle sprawled below them, a testament to ambition and innovation, but from their respective positions in the penthouse, Victoria and Maria saw it completely differently. Victoria saw a kingdom she had conquered, filled with opportunities to expand her influence and increase her wealth. Maria saw a place where dreams were possible if you were willing to work hard enough and sacrifice everything for them. Victoria's business empire had been built on luxury real estate developments, high-end commercial properties, and exclusive residential projects that catered to the wealthy elite. She had a talent for identifying prime locations before anyone else recognized their potential, and she had the capital and connections to move quickly when opportunities arose. Her success had made her a celebrity in Seattle's business community, with regular features in magazines and invitations to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship and leadership. But Victoria's success had come at a cost that she had never bothered to calculate. She had left a trail of damaged relationships, betrayed partnerships, and broken promises in her wake. She had used people when they were useful to her and discarded them when they weren't. She had stepped on competitors, manipulated suppliers, and exploited every advantage she could find, legal or otherwise. She told herself that this was just how business worked, that success required a certain ruthlessness that weaker people couldn't understand or stomach. Maria, meanwhile, had learned about business from a very different perspective. She watched Victoria operate, observed her methods, listened to her phone calls and meetings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She began to understand how deals were structured, how negotiations worked, how relationships in the business world were built and maintained. She didn't intend to spy, but working in the background of someone's life meant that you inevitably learned about their world whether you wanted to or not. What Maria saw disturbed her, but it also educated her. She watched Victoria lie to clients, manipulate contractors, and break promises whenever it served her purposes. She saw how Victoria used her wealth and connections to avoid consequences for behavior that would have destroyed someone with less power. But Maria also saw the weaknesses in Victoria's approach, the places where her cruelty and arrogance created vulnerabilities that a smarter competitor might exploit. Late at night, after finishing her second job and returning to the tiny apartment she shared with Carlos, Maria would lie awake thinking about what she had observed. She began to see patterns in Victoria's business dealings, to understand the strategies behind the success. She started reading business books from the library, studying during her commute on public transportation, learning everything she could about real estate, finance, and entrepreneurship. Carlos noticed the change in his sister. She had always been driven and hardworking, but now there was something different in her eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. When he asked her about it, Maria would just smile and tell him to focus on his studies, that everything she was doing was for his future. But privately, Maria was beginning to nurture a dream that went beyond just supporting her brother's education. She was beginning to imagine a future where she wouldn't have to clean Victoria's floors or endure her cruelty. A future where she could build something of her own, something that would prove that where you started in life didn't have to determine where you ended up. It was a dangerous dream for someone in her position, but it was also a powerful one, and it gave her strength during the darkest moments of her days. Victoria remained completely unaware of the transformation happening in her maid. To her, Maria was still just a help, an interchangeable part of the machinery that kept her life running smoothly. She never imagined that the young woman she treated like furniture was absorbing everything she saw, learning from every mistake Victoria made, and quietly building the knowledge and determination that would one day change everything. The rain continued to fall against the floor-to-ceiling windows as evening approached, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the marble floors. Victoria was preparing for another dinner party, another evening of showing off her wealth and status to friends who measured their worth by how effectively they could diminish others. She had no way of knowing that this particular evening would be different from all the others, that the events about to unfold would set in motion a chain of consequences that would ultimately destroy everything she had built. Maria moved through her evening tasks with the same quiet efficiency she always displayed, but tonight there was something different in the air. Maybe it was the storm raging outside, or maybe it was the accumulation of 8 months of daily humiliations finally reaching a breaking point, but something was about to change in that penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay. The ingredients for disaster were all in place. Victoria's cruelty had been building steadily, her treatment of Maria becoming more degrading with each passing week. Her friends had been encouraging this behavior, finding entertainment in the suffering of someone they considered beneath their notice. And Maria, despite her best efforts to remain invisible and endure whatever was thrown at her, was reaching the limit of what even her strong spirit could bear. Neither woman could have predicted what was about to happen, but the storm outside seemed to mirror the tension building inside the penthouse. Forces were gathering that would soon collide in a way that would change both their lives forever, setting them on paths that would eventually lead to a confrontation neither of them could imagine. The city lights twinkled below them like stars fallen to earth, each one representing a life, a dream, a story of struggle and hope. In just a few hours, Maria and Victoria would be forced to confront truths about themselves and each other that would shatter the carefully constructed world they had been living in. The evening that lay ahead would plant seeds that would grow for 10 years before finally bearing fruit in ways that neither woman could possibly foresee. Victoria's dinner parties followed the same ritual every Thursday evening. The caterers would arrive at 4 to begin preparing an elaborate meal that could have fed 20 people but would only serve 4. The florist would deliver fresh arrangements that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. Victoria would spend 2 hours getting ready, assisted by her personal stylist who maintained a key to the penthouse for exactly these occasions. Maria's role in these preparations was to ensure that every surface gleamed, every piece of crystal sparkled, and every detail was perfect for Victoria's guests. She had learned through painful experience that even the smallest imperfection would result in a humiliating lecture delivered in front of whatever audience happened to be present. Tonight's guest list was the usual trio of Amanda, Catherine, and Sarah, 3 women who had made cruelty into an art form. They arrived within minutes of each other, as they always did, their expensive cars delivered by valets who would wait outside until the evening ended. Each woman was dressed to display her wealth, wearing jewelry that could have funded a small business and carrying purses that cost more than Maria's annual salary. Victoria greeted her friends with the kind of artificial warmth that wealthy people had perfected for social occasions. Air kisses were exchanged, compliments on appearances were delivered and received, and drinks were poured from bottles of wine that had been selected specifically for their impressive price tags rather than their actual quality. Maria served the drinks on a silver tray that she had polished until it reflected the room's lighting like a mirror. She moved quietly from guest to guest, keeping her eyes downcast as Victoria had instructed her to do months ago. She was not supposed to make eye contact with the guests, not supposed to speak unless directly asked a question, and certainly not supposed to show any reaction to their conversations or behavior. The women settled into the living area, their laughter sharp and cutting as they began their usual routine of gossiping about people who weren't present to defend themselves. Maria continued her work in the kitchen, preparing the final courses of the meal while listening to the conversation flow in the next room. Amanda was describing her latest shopping trip to Paris, complaining about the quality of service at luxury stores that most people would never be able to afford to enter. Catherine was sharing details about her recent divorce settlement, gloating about how much money she had managed to extract from her former husband. Sarah was planning a vacation to a private island in the Caribbean, debating whether to take her yacht or simply fly directly to the resort. Their problems were not real problems, Maria reflected as she arranged food on plates that were worth more than her monthly rent. These women had never worried about keeping the lights on, never chosen between medicine and groceries, never lain awake at night wondering how they would pay for their family's basic needs. They lived in a fantasy world where money solved everything and anyone without money simply didn't matter. The conversation shifted when Victoria mentioned that she was considering firing her current housekeeper because the woman had asked for a raise after 3 years of employment. The request had offended Victoria, who felt that domestic workers should be grateful for whatever they were given rather than making demands about their compensation. Amanda laughed at this story, suggesting that Victoria should have fired the woman immediately for having the audacity to ask for more money. Catherine agreed, adding that domestic help had become far too entitled in recent years, forgetting their proper place in the social hierarchy. Sarah proposed that Victoria should make an example of the woman by ensuring she never found work with any of their social circle, effectively blacklisting her from employment opportunities. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she listened to this conversation. The casual cruelty with which these women discussed destroying someone's livelihood was breathtaking, even after months of witnessing their behavior. She thought about the housekeeper they were discussing, a woman she had never met but who was probably just like her, working hard to support her family and hoping for nothing more than fair treatment and decent wages. The dinner was served in courses, each one more elaborate than necessary, each one requiring Maria to enter the dining room and serve the women while they continued their conversations as if she weren't there. She had perfected the art of being invisible, moving efficiently and silently through her tasks while the guests ignored her presence completely. But tonight, something was different. Maybe it was the storm raging outside, or maybe it was the accumulation of months of small humiliations finally reaching a breaking point. Whatever the cause, Maria found herself paying closer attention to the women's conversation, really listening to their words rather than simply enduring them. Victoria was describing a recent business deal where she had deliberately misled a competitor to gain an advantage in a bidding process. She seemed proud of her deception, describing it as clever strategy rather than unethical behavior. Her friends praised her ruthlessness, treating her dishonesty as evidence of her business acumen rather than her moral failings. Amanda shared a story about evicting an elderly tenant from one of her rental properties, describing how she had used legal technicalities to force the woman out so she could raise the rent for a younger, wealthier tenant. She laughed about the old woman's tears, imitating her pleas for more time to find alternative housing. Catherine boasted about how she had used her connections to prevent a former employee from finding work after the woman had complained about unsafe working conditions in Catherine's factory. She had made phone calls to colleagues throughout the industry, spreading false rumors about the woman's character and work ethic to ensure she remained unemployed. Sarah described how she had manipulated a charity auction to ensure that her own donation received the most attention, even though it was smaller than several others. She had used her influence with the event organizers to minimize recognition for larger donations while maximizing publicity for her own contribution. With each story, Maria felt something building inside her chest. These women weren't just wealthy, they were actively cruel, using their money and power to hurt people who couldn't fight back. They took pleasure in the suffering of others, treating human lives like game pieces to be moved around for their entertainment. As Maria served the main course, her hands trembled slightly with suppressed anger. She set the plates down carefully, maintaining her professional demeanor even as her heart raced with indignation. She thought about Carlos, working late into the night on his engineering projects, never knowing how their tuition was being paid or what his sister endured to keep him in school. Victoria noticed Maria's slight tremor and decided to comment on it. She looked up from her meal with cold eyes and spoke in a voice loud enough for all her guests to hear. "Girl," she said, using her preferred term for Maria, "your hands are shaking. Are you nervous about something?" The other women looked up from their plates, suddenly interested in this interruption to their dinner conversation. Maria felt their eyes on her like searchlights, examining her for signs of weakness or discomfort. "No, ma'am," Maria replied quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I apologize if I disturbed you." Victoria smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was the smile of a predator who had detected vulnerability in potential prey. "You didn't disturb me," Victoria said, her voice carrying a dangerous undertone. "I'm just curious about what could make someone so nervous when all they have to do is serve dinner to civilized people." The word civilized hung in the air like a challenge. Maria knew that Victoria was baiting her, looking for a reaction that would justify whatever humiliation she had planned. But Maria also knew that she couldn't afford to lose this job, couldn't risk the confrontation that Victoria seemed to be inviting. Amanda leaned forward in her chair, sensing entertainment approaching. Catherine and Sarah exchanged glances, their eyes bright with anticipation. They had witnessed Victoria's treatment of staff before, and they knew that something interesting was about to happen. "Maybe she's nervous because she knows she doesn't belong in a place like this," Amanda suggested, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Some people just can't handle being around quality." Catherine nodded in agreement. It must be overwhelming for someone from her background to see how successful people actually live. The difference in standards must be quite shocking. Sarah added her own observation. "I've noticed that domestic workers sometimes get ideas above their station when they're exposed to wealth. They start thinking they're entitled to things they haven't earned." Maria continued clearing plates, her movements mechanical as she fought to maintain her composure. She had heard variations of these comments before, but tonight they seemed particularly sharp, cutting deeper than usual. Maybe it was because she had been listening more carefully to their conversations, really understanding the depth of their cruelty rather than simply enduring it. Victoria watched Maria's face carefully, looking for signs of the reaction she was trying to provoke. She had played this game many times before with various staff members, pushing them until they either quit or gave her an excuse to fire them. It was one of her favorite forms of entertainment, a way of asserting her dominance while amusing her friends. "You know," Victoria said, setting down her wine glass with deliberate precision, "I've been thinking about what we were discussing earlier. About domestic help getting too comfortable, forgetting their proper place." Maria's hands stilled for just a moment as she sensed the direction this conversation was taking. She forced herself to continue clearing the table, hoping that if she remained silent and efficient, Victoria would lose interest and move on to another topic. But Victoria was not ready to let this moment pass. She had been planning something special for tonight's entertainment, something that would remind Maria exactly where she stood in the social hierarchy while providing her friends with the kind of show they had come to expect from these dinner parties. "I think it's important," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident, "to occasionally remind people of their proper place in the world. Not out of cruelty, you understand, but out of kindness. It prevents them from developing unrealistic expectations that will only lead to disappointment later." Amanda clapped her hands together softly, recognizing the setup for whatever Victoria had planned. Catherine and Sarah leaned forward in their chairs, their attention fully focused on the drama about to unfold. Maria felt the weight of their collective attention like a physical presence in the room. Her instincts told her to leave, to find some excuse to retreat to the kitchen or another part of the penthouse, but she knew that running would only make whatever Victoria had planned even worse. Victoria stood up from her chair, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had never doubted her right to command any room she entered. She walked around the table until she was standing directly behind Maria, close enough that Maria could smell her expensive perfume and feel the heat radiating from her body. "I want to tell you all a story," Victoria said, addressing her friends but speaking loudly enough for Maria to hear every word. "About a lesson I learned early in my career, about the importance of knowing your place and staying in it." The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Maria's heart began to race as she realized that she was not just witnessing whatever Victoria had planned, she was going to be the central participant in it. Victoria moved around the dining table with the calculated precision of a chess master positioning her pieces for checkmate. Her emerald eyes glittered with anticipation as she prepared to deliver whatever lesson she had been planning throughout the evening. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Maria stood frozen beside the dining table, her hands still gripping the stack of plates she had been clearing. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to find some excuse to leave the room, but her feet seemed rooted to the marble floor. She had learned through months of experience that attempting to escape Victoria's attention only made things worse. Amanda, Catherine, and Sarah watched from their seats with the hungry expressions of spectators at a gladiatorial arena. They had witnessed Victoria's cruelty before, but tonight felt different. There was an electric tension in the air that promised something more dramatic than the usual verbal humiliations they had come to expect. Victoria reached across the table and picked up a dinner roll that had been left untouched on her plate. She held it up to the light, examining it as if it were a precious gemstone rather than a simple piece of bread. The roll was beautifully crafted, golden brown and still warm from the oven, the kind of artisanal bread that cost more per pound than most people spent on an entire meal. "You know what I find fascinating about bread?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering a lecture to students. "It's such a basic food, isn't it? The foundation of human civilization, some historians say. But there are so many different types of bread, so many different qualities." She turned the roll over in her manicured hands, her movements deliberate and theatrical. Maria watched in growing dread, sensing that this seemingly innocent observation was building towards something terrible. "There's the bread that graces tables like this one," Victoria continued, gesturing toward the elegant dining room with its crystal chandelier and priceless artwork. "Crafted by master bakers, made with the finest ingredients, served to people who appreciate quality and refinement." Amanda nodded approvingly, understanding that she was expected to participate in whatever performance Victoria was orchestrating. "Absolutely. The difference in quality is remarkable when you know what to look for." And then, Victoria's voice took on a darker tone, "There's the bread that feeds the masses. Cheap, mass-produced, lacking in character or distinction. The kind of bread that satisfies hunger without providing any real nourishment for the soul." Catherine picked up the thread, her voice dripping with condescension. "Some people simply don't have the palate to appreciate the finer things in life. They're content with whatever scraps they can find." Sarah added her own contribution to the narrative Victoria was building. "It's really quite sad when you think about it. Imagine going through life never experiencing true quality, never understanding what you're missing. Maria felt her stomach clench as she began to understand where this conversation was heading. The three women were setting up some kind of twisted metaphor, using bread as a vehicle for whatever humiliation Victoria had planned. She wanted to speak, to interrupt this cruel theater before it could reach its intended climax, but she knew that any attempt to defend herself would only make things worse. Victoria walked slowly around the table until she was standing directly in front of Maria. The height difference between them was pronounced, with Victoria's expensive heels adding several inches to her already imposing stature. She looked down at Maria with the expression of someone examining an interesting insect. "The question is," Victoria said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "how do we help people understand their proper place in the world? How do we teach them to be grateful for what they have instead of aspiring to things that are beyond their reach?" The roll was still in Victoria's hands, and now she began to break it apart with her fingers. Crumbs fell to the marble floor like snow, each piece landing with a soft sound that seemed amplified in the tense silence of the room. "I believe in practical education," Victoria announced, dropping the pieces of bread onto the floor at Maria's feet. "The kind of lessons that stick with you, that remind you of important truths about the natural order of things." Maria stared down at the scattered crumbs, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. The bread lay on the pristine marble floor like tiny monuments to Victoria's cruelty, each piece a deliberate insult designed to break down Maria's dignity. "I want you to pick those up," Victoria said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact, as if she were asking Maria to water a plant or adjust a window blind. "With your mouth." The words hung in the air like a physical presence, so shocking that Maria wondered if she had misheard them. She looked up at Victoria's face, searching for some sign that this was a cruel joke, that the request wasn't serious. But Victoria's expression was perfectly composed, her eyes steady and determined. "I'm sorry," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain against the windows. "You heard me correctly," Victoria replied, speaking slowly and clearly as if addressing a child. "I want you to get down on your hands and knees and pick up those crumbs with your mouth. Every single piece." Amanda gasped dramatically, pressing her hand to her chest in mock surprise. "Victoria, you're absolutely wicked." "I love it." Catherine laughed, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. "Oh, this is perfect. A little reminder about proper station in life." Sarah pulled out her phone, her fingers dancing across the screen as she prepared to document whatever was about to happen. "This is definitely going to be worth remembering." Maria felt the blood drain from her face as the full implications of Victoria's demand hit her. This wasn't just about picking up breadcrumbs. This was about reducing her to the level of an animal, forcing her to perform an act so degrading that it would strip away every shred of her human dignity. "Please," Maria said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to keep it steady. "I'll clean it up with a cloth. I'll make sure the floor is spotless. You don't need to ask me to do this." Victoria's smile widened, revealing perfect white teeth that somehow made her look more predatory rather than more beautiful. "But I am asking you to do this. And you're going to do it because you need this job, don't you? You need the money I pay you every week." The truth of that statement hit Maria like a physical blow. She did need this job desperately. Every dollar Victoria paid her went directly toward Carlos's tuition, his books, his living expenses. Without this income, her brother would have to drop out of school, would have to abandon the dream that had kept both of them motivated through years of struggle and sacrifice. "Think about it carefully," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone offering helpful advice. "Is your pride really worth more than your brother's education? Is maintaining your dignity worth destroying his future?" Maria's legs felt weak beneath her as she realized the impossible position Victoria had created. There was no good choice here, no way to escape this situation with her self-respect intact. Either she could submit to this humiliation and keep the job that supported her family, or she could refuse and lose everything she had worked so hard to achieve. Amanda leaned forward in her chair, her eyes bright with excitement. "Come on, dear. It's just a little bread. It's not like Victoria is asking you to do anything truly harmful. Exactly, Catherine agreed. It's simply a matter of perspective. Some people might see this as degrading, but others would recognize it as an opportunity to demonstrate loyalty and commitment. Sarah held her phone higher, ensuring she would get the best possible angle for whatever was about to happen. Besides, think of all the internet fame you'll have. This is going to be absolutely viral. Maria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to block out the voices of Victoria's friends, trying to find some center of calm in the storm of emotions raging inside her. She thought about Carlos, probably studying in his dorm room at that very moment, working on the engineering projects that would define his future. She thought about her parents, gone now but still present in her memory, their voices reminding her to do whatever it took to take care of her family. When she opened her eyes, Victoria was still standing there, still waiting for her answer. The breadcrumbs lay scattered on the floor like a test, like a challenge that would determine the course of the rest of her life. "If I do this," Maria said quietly, her voice barely audible above the storm outside, "you'll keep paying me? You won't fire me?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "Of course. You're a good worker when you remember your place. I have no reason to let you go as long as you continue to understand the nature of our relationship." Maria looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of the four women who were watching her with varying degrees of amusement and anticipation. These people lived in a world so removed from her own that they might as well have been from different planets. They had never known hunger, never felt the weight of responsibility for another person's future, never faced a choice between dignity and survival. But Maria had known all of these things, and more. She had learned that life sometimes demanded sacrifices that cut deeper than any physical wound. She had discovered that love could make you do things you never imagined possible, could push you beyond the boundaries of what you thought you could endure. Slowly, as if moving through thick water, Maria lowered herself to her knees. The marble floor was cold against her skin, even through the fabric of her uniform. She could hear the women's breathing, could sense their anticipation as they waited to see if she would actually go through with Victoria's twisted demand. Maria placed her hands on the floor and leaned forward, bringing her face closer to the scattered crumbs. The bread smelled faintly of herbs and butter, innocent ingredients that had been transformed into instruments of humiliation by Victoria's cruelty. The first crumb touched her lips like a kiss of shame. It was still warm, still soft, but it tasted like ashes in her mouth. Maria forced herself to swallow, to continue moving across the floor, picking up each piece with her teeth while the four women watched and commented as if she were performing in some kind of grotesque dinner theater. Amanda clapped her hands together softly, her voice filled with delighted surprise. "Oh my goodness, she's actually doing it. Victoria, you are absolutely brilliant." Catherine held her wine glass aloft as if making a toast. To proper education. Sometimes the most important lessons are the most uncomfortable ones. Sarah continued recording with her phone, moving around the table to capture different angles of Maria's degradation. "This is incredible. The internet is going to lose its mind over this." Victoria stood watching with her arms crossed, her expression one of satisfied superiority. She had proven her point, demonstrated her power, reminded everyone in the room exactly who was in charge. This was better than any business deal, more satisfying than any financial victory she had ever achieved. Maria continued her humiliating task, moving methodically across the marble floor, her mind retreating to a place where the physical sensations and emotional pain couldn't reach her. She thought about Carlos, about the pride in his voice when he called to tell her about his grades, about the way his face lit up when he talked about his engineering projects. She thought about her parents, about the promises she had made to them before they died, about the responsibility she had accepted when she became her brother's guardian. Each crumb she swallowed was a small piece of her dignity being consumed, but it was also a small payment toward Carlos's future. Each moment of this humiliation was bringing her brother closer to graduation, closer to the career that would lift their family out of poverty forever. The task seemed to take hours, though it was probably only minutes. When Maria finally lifted her head, the floor was clean, every crumb gone. Her face was flushed with shame, her hands shaking with suppressed emotion, but she had completed what Victoria had demanded. Victoria nodded approvingly, as if Maria had just demonstrated some particularly impressive skill. Very good. You see how simple it is when people understand their proper role in life? Amanda burst into applause, her laugh high and sharp. Bravo! That was absolutely perfect. You should charge admission for entertainment like this. Catherine raised her wine glass again. To Victoria, for providing such educational experiences. Not everyone has the courage to teach these important lessons. Sarah was still recording, her phone capturing Maria's face as she slowly got to her feet. This is going to be everywhere by tomorrow morning. You're about to become very famous, dear. Maria stood up on unsteady legs, her knees aching from the cold marble floor. She smoothed down her uniform with trembling hands, trying to restore some semblance of professional appearance. Her face burned with shame, but she forced herself to meet Victoria's eyes. May I continue clearing the table, ma'am? She asked, her voice somehow remaining steady despite the turmoil inside her. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. Of course. And Maria? She used Maria's actual name for the first time in months, the sound of it strange and almost mocking in her mouth. I hope you understand that this was for your own good. Sometimes we all need reminders about where we belong in the world. Maria nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. She began gathering the remaining dishes, her movements mechanical as she tried to process what had just happened. The women returned to their conversation, already moving on to other topics as if the degradation they had just witnessed was nothing more than a momentary diversion. But for Maria, everything had changed. The humiliation she had just endured wasn't just a single moment of cruelty, it was a line that had been crossed, a boundary that could never be restored. Something had broken inside her during those minutes on the floor, but something else had been born as well. A cold determination, a quiet rage that would burn steady and low for years to come. As she worked in the kitchen, washing dishes and preparing for the women's departure, Maria found herself thinking not about what had just happened, but about what might happen in the future. She thought about Victoria's business, about the weaknesses she had observed, about the opportunities that might exist for someone smart enough and patient enough to exploit them. The women's laughter continued to drift in from the dining room, their voices growing louder and more reckless as they consumed more wine. They were celebrating Victoria's victory, congratulating her on the entertainment she had provided, already planning to share the story with others in their social circle. But Maria was planning too. As she scrubbed plates and polished glasses, her mind was working through possibilities, considering options, laying the groundwork for something that would take years to achieve but would be worth every moment of patience it required. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly as notifications poured in from whatever social media platform she had used to share the video. The sound was like a countdown timer, marking the seconds until Maria's humiliation became public knowledge, until her degradation was transformed into entertainment for strangers around the world. Within hours, the video would have thousands of views. Within days, it would reach millions. Maria Rodriguez would become famous, but not in any way she had ever wanted or imagined. Her face would be recognized by people she had never met, her story told and retold until it became legend. But fame, as Victoria would soon discover, was a double-edged sword. The same technology that could spread cruelty around the world in seconds could also mobilize compassion with equal speed. The same platforms that could be used to humiliate could also be used to organize, to fight back, to demand justice. As the evening wore on and Victoria's guests finally departed, leaving behind empty wine bottles and the lingering scent of expensive perfume, Maria finished her cleaning duties in silence. She moved through the penthouse like a ghost, straightening cushions and wiping surfaces while her mind raced with thoughts and plans and possibilities. Victoria had gone to bed, satisfied with her evening's entertainment, confident that she had once again proven her dominance over someone she considered inferior. She slept peacefully in her luxury bedroom, surrounded by silk sheets and down pillows, dreaming of business deals and social victories. But Maria didn't sleep. She sat in her tiny apartment across town, staring at her phone as notifications continued to pour in. The video was spreading faster than wildfire, shared and reshared by people who were either entertained by her humiliation or outraged by Victoria's cruelty. Carlos called just after midnight, his voice thick with emotion. He had seen the video, had watched his sister's degradation play out on his computer screen. He wanted to drive to Victoria's penthouse immediately, wanted to confront the woman who had humiliated his sister so publicly. But Maria stopped him. She told him to stay focused on his studies, to ignore the video and the comments and the attention. She told him that everything she had done was for him, for his future, and that she needed him to honor that sacrifice by continuing to work toward his degree. What she didn't tell him was that she had already begun planning her revenge. Not the quick, hot revenge of physical confrontation or public scandal, but the slow, patient revenge of someone who understood that the best victories were the ones that took time to achieve. As the night wore on and the video continued to spread across the internet, Maria began to research. She looked up business registration requirements, investigated loan programs for small businesses, studied the real estate market in Seattle. She read about Victoria's company, analyzed their recent projects, identified their competitors and their weaknesses. By dawn, Maria had filled several pages with notes and plans and ideas. The sun rose over Elliott Bay, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, marking the beginning of a new day and a new chapter in both women's lives. Victoria woke up to find herself trending on social media, but not in the way she had expected. The video that Sarah had shared was being viewed by millions of people, but the comments weren't celebrating Victoria's power or praising her business acumen. Instead, they were filled with outrage, with demands for boycotts of her company, with expressions of support for the woman she had humiliated. Maria woke up to find herself famous, her face recognized by strangers, her story told around the world. But instead of feeling ashamed, she felt energized. The humiliation Victoria had intended to break her had instead freed her from the last vestiges of fear and doubt. She had endured the worst that Victoria could do to her, had survived it with her core strength intact. Now she was ready to begin the long process of building something that would eventually allow her to face Victoria again, but this time as an equal. This time as someone with her own power, her own resources, her own ability to determine the outcome of their confrontation. The storm had passed, leaving behind clear skies and fresh air. But the real storm was just beginning, and it would rage for 10 years before finally reaching its conclusion in ways that neither Maria nor Victoria could possibly imagine. The notification sound from Maria's phone had become a constant companion over the past 72 hours. Each ping brought another comment, another share, another person discovering the video that had turned her life upside down. She sat in the university library where Carlos studied, having taken refuge in the quiet anonymity of the stacks while the storm of internet attention raged around her. 3 days had passed since Victoria's dinner party, and the video had reached 15 million views across multiple platforms. The hashtag Justice for Maria was trending worldwide, and Victoria Sterling's name had become synonymous with corporate cruelty and abuse of power. But for Maria, the viral fame felt like a second layer of humiliation, her most degrading moment replayed endlessly for the entertainment of strangers. She had quit her job at Victoria's penthouse the morning after the dinner party, sending a simple text message that she would not be returning. Victoria had responded with cold indifference, as if losing Maria was no more significant than replacing a broken appliance. But Maria knew that Victoria's world was about to become much more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The first major consequence arrived in the form of a phone call to Victoria's office from the Seattle Business Journal. A reporter named Jessica Chen had been following the story and wanted to interview Victoria about the video and its implications for her company's reputation. Victoria dismissed the call with characteristic arrogance, instructing her assistant to tell any reporters that she had no comment on private matters. But the story wouldn't disappear so easily. Within hours of Victoria's refusal to comment, Jessica Chen had published an investigative piece that went far beyond the dinner party video. She had interviewed former employees of Victoria's company, spoken with contractors who had worked on her projects, and compiled a damning portrait of systematic abuse and exploitation. The article revealed that Victoria's treatment of Maria wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern of behavior that extended throughout her business empire. Former employees described a toxic work environment where harassment was commonplace and complaints were met with retaliation. Contractors told stories of unpaid invoices, broken contracts, and legal threats designed to force them into submission. One particularly devastating account came from a former project manager named Robert Kim, who had worked for Victoria's company for 3 years before quitting in disgust. He described how Victoria had deliberately sabotaged a competitor's project by bribing city inspectors to find violations that didn't exist. The resulting delays had cost the competing company millions of dollars and eventually forced them into bankruptcy. Another former employee, Linda Martinez, revealed that Victoria had a practice of hiring undocumented workers for her construction projects, paying them below minimum wage while threatening to call immigration authorities if they complained about working conditions. The article included photographs of unsafe job sites, testimonials from injured workers who had been denied medical care, and documentation of environmental violations that Victoria's company had covered up. As the article spread across social media and news outlets, the public reaction was swift and severe. Victoria's company website crashed under the weight of angry comments and negative reviews. Protesters gathered outside her office building, carrying signs that read "Corporate Bully" and "Justice for Workers." Local news stations began running segments about workplace abuse and corporate responsibility, using Victoria's story as a cautionary tale. The financial impact was immediate and devastating. 3 major clients canceled contracts worth over $50 million within the first week after the video went viral. The Seattle City Council announced that they were reviewing all contracts with Victoria's company and considering a ban on future business dealings. Environmental groups filed complaints with state regulators, demanding investigations into the violations revealed in the article. Victoria's response to the growing crisis was characteristically tone-deaf. She hired an expensive public relations firm to help manage the situation, but their advice to issue a sincere apology and make substantive changes to her business practices was rejected outright. Instead, Victoria chose to double down on her position, releasing a statement that blamed the controversy on disgruntled former employees and social media mob mentality. The statement only made things worse. Victoria claimed that the dinner party video had been taken out of context, that Maria had volunteered to clean up the breadcrumbs, and that the entire incident had been blown out of proportion by people who didn't understand the realities of employer-employee relationships. She accused her critics of engaging in class warfare and suggested that successful business leaders were being unfairly targeted by people who resented their achievements. Maria watched Victoria's public relations disaster unfold from the quiet sanctuary of the library, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had never intended for the video to become a global phenomenon, had never wanted her humiliation to be witnessed by millions of strangers. But she couldn't deny a certain grim pleasure in seeing Victoria's arrogance finally being challenged by forces beyond her control. More importantly, Maria was using this time to plan her future. The library became her second home as she researched business strategies, studied real estate markets, and learned everything she could about corporate finance and management. She read biographies of successful entrepreneurs, studied case studies of companies that had overcome difficult circumstances, and began to develop a comprehensive understanding of the industry that Victoria dominated. Carlos had initially been devastated by the video and the attention it brought to their family. He wanted to transfer to a different school, to change his name, to hide from the scrutiny that came with being related to someone who had become internet famous for all the wrong reasons. But Maria convinced him to stay focused on his studies, reminding him that his education was still the key to their family's future. What Carlos didn't know was that Maria had begun receiving offers of financial support from strangers around the world. A GoFundMe campaign started by a complete stranger had raised over $300,000 in just 2 weeks. Lawyers were offering to work pro bono on any legal action she might want to pursue against Victoria. Business schools were reaching out with scholarship offers, recognizing her story as an example of resilience in the face of adversity. But Maria had learned to be cautious about accepting help from others. She had seen how quickly Victoria's apparent kindness had turned into cruelty, and she wasn't eager to put herself in a position where she might be vulnerable to similar manipulation. Instead, she began developing her own plan, one that would rely on her own skills and determination rather than the charity of strangers. The first step was education. Maria used some of the GoFundMe money to enroll in night classes at Seattle Community College, taking courses in business administration, accounting, and real estate law. She studied with the same intensity that had carried her through high school while working multiple jobs, staying up late into the night to master concepts that would have been foreign to her just months earlier. During the day, she found work at a small property management company owned by an older man named David Park. David had seen the video and the subsequent news coverage, and he had been impressed by Maria's dignity in the face of such public humiliation. He offered her a job that paid better than her work for Victoria while also providing valuable experience in the real estate industry. David became an unexpected mentor, teaching Maria about property valuation, market analysis, and the complex web of relationships that drove the Seattle real estate market. He had been in the business for 30 years and had watched Victoria's rise to prominence with growing concern about her methods and ethics. He was more than happy to share his knowledge with someone who might eventually provide some much-needed competition. Under David's guidance, Maria began to understand the vulnerabilities in Victoria's business model. Victoria's company relied heavily on a network of political connections and exclusive relationships with wealthy clients. She had built her empire by cutting corners, intimidating competitors, and exploiting workers, but these practices had also created numerous potential points of failure. Maria learned that several of Victoria's major projects were built on shaky financial foundations, with construction loans that carried high interest rates and strict repayment schedules. The company's cash flow was heavily dependent on completing projects on time and maintaining relationships with key clients. The recent exodus of customers was putting enormous pressure on Victoria's ability to meet her financial obligations. More importantly, Maria discovered that Victoria's company had made numerous enemies over the years. Competitors who had been driven out of business, workers who had been exploited, contractors who had been cheated out of payment. These people were scattered throughout the industry, nursing grudges and waiting for an opportunity to strike back. Maria began to see herself not as a lone individual seeking revenge, but as a potential catalyst for a larger reckoning. As her knowledge and confidence grew, Maria began to develop specific plans for her eventual confrontation with Victoria. She identified properties that Victoria was interested in acquiring, studied the financing structures of ongoing projects, and mapped the network of relationships that sustained Victoria's business empire. She was building a comprehensive understanding of her enemy's strengths and weaknesses, preparing for a battle that might take years to win. Meanwhile, Victoria's world continued to crumble around her. The protests outside her office building had become a daily occurrence, with local news stations treating them as a regular part of their coverage. The Seattle City Council had voted unanimously to terminate all contracts with Victoria's company and to ban the city from doing business with her in the future. Federal regulators had launched investigations into the environmental and labor violations revealed in the media coverage. Victoria's personal life was also falling apart. Her friends Amanda, Catherine, and Sarah had distanced themselves from her as the controversy intensified, suddenly finding themselves too busy to take her calls or attend her social events. The exclusive social circles that had once welcomed Victoria now treated her like a pariah, unwilling to risk their own reputations by associating with someone who had become a symbol of corporate abuse. Her romantic relationships suffered as well. Victoria had been dating a prominent Seattle attorney named Michael Harrison, but he ended their relationship after his law firm's partners expressed concern about the negative publicity. Other men she had been involved with similarly disappeared from her life, unwilling to be connected with someone whose reputation had become so toxic. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult part of Victoria's ordeal. She had always been accustomed to being surrounded by people who competed for her attention and approval. Her wealth and power had attracted a constant stream of admirers, business partners, and social climbers who valued access to her resources and connections. But now she found herself alone in her penthouse, with only her own thoughts and the sound of protesters chanting outside her building for company. Victoria's attempts to rebuild her reputation only made things worse. She hired a series of public relations firms, each one promising to restore her image and repair the damage to her business. But their efforts consistently backfired, generating more negative publicity and reinforcing the public perception of her as an out-of-touch elitist who couldn't accept responsibility for her actions. One particularly disastrous attempt involved a staged charity event where Victoria planned to donate money to organizations that supported domestic workers' rights. The event was intended to demonstrate her commitment to making amends for her past behavior, but protesters disrupted the proceedings and the media coverage focused on the apparent insincerity of Victoria's gesture. Another failed strategy involved hiring a crisis management consultant who specialized in rehabilitating the images of controversial public figures. The consultant recommended that Victoria undergo sensitivity training, participate in community service, and make a series of public apologies. But Victoria's pride prevented her from following through on these recommendations, and she fired the consultant after just 2 weeks. As Victoria's reputation continued to deteriorate, her business empire began to collapse in earnest. Major investors pulled their money from her projects, citing concerns about reputational risk and regulatory scrutiny. Banks became reluctant to extend credit, demanding higher interest rates and more stringent collateral requirements. Construction crews walked off job sites, unwilling to work for a company that had become synonymous with worker exploitation. The financial pressure became overwhelming. Victoria was forced to sell several properties at significant losses just to meet her immediate obligations. She laid off dozens of employees, further damaging her reputation and reducing her company's capacity to complete ongoing projects. Legal fees consumed increasing amounts of her resources as she fought investigations, lawsuits, and regulatory actions on multiple fronts. By the end of the first year after the video went viral, Victoria's company had lost over 60% of its value. What had once been a thriving empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars was now a struggling business barely managing to stay afloat. Victoria herself had gone from being celebrated as one of Seattle's most successful entrepreneurs to being reviled as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and privilege. Maria watched Victoria's decline with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. Part of her felt vindicated seeing the woman who had humiliated her face the consequences of her actions. But another part of her recognized that Victoria's suffering, while perhaps deserved, was ultimately destructive rather than constructive. Maria wanted more than just to see Victoria punished, she wanted to build something positive from the ashes of their confrontation. As the months passed, Maria's own transformation accelerated. She completed her community college courses with perfect grades, earning certificates in business administration and real estate management. David Park promoted her to assistant manager at his property management company, giving her responsibility for several high-profile accounts and valuable experience in client relations. Maria also began investing some of the money from the GoFundMe campaign in small real estate deals. She started with modest purchases, buying distressed properties that she could renovate and resell for a profit. Her first project was a small duplex in a working-class neighborhood, which she purchased for $30,000 and spent 3 months renovating with the help of Carlos and some of his engineering classmates. The renovation was more than just a business venture, it was a statement of principles. Maria hired local workers at fair wages, used environmentally sustainable materials whenever possible, and designed the improvements to benefit both the tenants and the surrounding community. When she sold the duplex 6 months later for $55,000, the profit was substantial, but more importantly, she had demonstrated that it was possible to succeed in real estate without exploiting workers or cutting corners. Word of Maria's approach to business began to spread through Seattle's real estate community. Contractors who had been mistreated by Victoria's company reached out to offer their services. Community organizations praised Maria's commitment to ethical business practices. Local media outlets began covering her projects as examples of responsible development that prioritized people over profits. Maria's reputation grew as Victoria's continued to decline. She was invited to speak at community meetings about gentrification and affordable housing. Business schools asked her to guest lecture about ethics and entrepreneurship. Advocacy groups recognized her as an example of how ordinary people could challenge powerful interests and create positive change. But Maria never forgot that her ultimate goal was not just personal success, but a direct confrontation with Victoria Sterling. She continued to monitor Victoria's business activities, tracking her financial struggles and identifying opportunities where their interests might intersect. Maria was patient, methodical, and utterly determined to ensure that when their paths crossed again, she would be ready. The opportunity came sooner than Maria had expected. 3 years after the dinner party video went viral, Victoria's company was forced to put several properties up for sale to avoid bankruptcy. Among these properties was a historic office building in downtown Seattle that had been one of the cornerstones of Victoria's real estate portfolio. The building was in need of significant renovations, but it was located in a prime area and had enormous potential for someone with the vision and resources to restore it properly. Maria had been preparing for exactly this kind of opportunity. She had spent 3 years building her own real estate portfolio, establishing relationships with contractors and investors, and developing a reputation for ethical business practices. When the historic office building came on the market, she was ready to make a competitive bid. The auction was held on a rainy Thursday morning in November, exactly 3 years and 7 months after Victoria had forced Maria to eat breadcrumbs off her dining room floor. Maria arrived at the courthouse wearing a professional business suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, carrying a briefcase that contained all the documentation needed to complete the purchase. Victoria was there too, looking haggard and desperate as she tried to maintain some control over the sale of her properties. She had lost weight over the past 3 years, and her once perfect appearance showed signs of the stress she had been under. When she saw Maria enter the auction room, her face went pale with recognition and something that might have been fear. The bidding was intense, with several developers competing for the prime downtown property. Maria bid strategically, never revealing her maximum price but steadily raising her offers to stay competitive. She could see Victoria watching her from across the room, probably wondering how a former domestic worker could possibly have the resources to compete for such an expensive property. When the auction ended, Maria had won the building with a bid of $2.8 million. She had secured financing through a combination of her own savings, investor partnerships, and a construction loan from a bank that had been impressed by her track record of successful projects. As she signed the paperwork, Maria felt a profound sense of accomplishment that went far beyond the simple purchase of real estate. Victoria approached her as she was leaving the courthouse, her expression a mixture of confusion and barely controlled anger. They stood facing each other in the marble hallway, surrounded by lawyers and real estate agents who sensed the tension but didn't understand its source. "I don't know how you did this," Victoria said, her voice low and tight with emotion. "But don't think this means anything. You're still the same person who was crawling around on my floor 3 years ago." Maria looked at Victoria steadily, feeling none of the fear or intimidation that had once made her tremble in this woman's presence. She had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building not just financial resources but inner strength and confidence that no one could take away from her. "You're right," Maria said calmly. "I am the same person. I'm someone who will do whatever it takes to protect my family and build a better future. The difference is that now I have the resources to do it properly, without having to beg for scraps from people who think they're better than me." Victoria's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Maria continued. "I want to thank you, actually. That night in your penthouse taught me something important about the world and about myself. You showed me what I was capable of enduring, and more importantly, what I was capable of achieving when I stopped letting other people define my worth." With that, Maria turned and walked away, leaving Victoria standing alone in the courthouse hallway. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the Seattle rain, Maria felt as if she were walking into a new chapter of her life. She had won more than just a building, she had won the right to face Victoria as an equal, to compete in the same arena where Victoria had once seemed untouchable. The historic office building would become the foundation of Maria's real estate empire, just as Victoria's humiliation had become the foundation of her downfall. But this was only the beginning of their story. Maria had plans for that building, and for her future relationship with Victoria Sterling, that would take 7 more years to fully unfold. The young woman who had once cleaned Victoria's floors was about to become someone who could reshape the entire Seattle real estate market, and Victoria was about to learn that true power came not from money or connections, but from the determination to never give up on your dreams. 7 years had transformed the Seattle skyline in ways that reflected the dramatic shift in power between two women whose lives had become intertwined by cruelty and redemption. The gleaming Rodriguez Development Tower now stood 42 stories tall in the heart of downtown, its glass facade catching the morning light like a beacon of possibility. From the penthouse office on the top floor, Maria Rodriguez looked out over a city where her name had become synonymous with ethical business practices and community development. The transformation had been gradual but unstoppable. After purchasing Victoria's historic office building at that courthouse auction 7 years ago, Maria had methodically expanded her real estate empire with the same patience and determination that had carried her through those dark months as Victoria's domestic worker. Each project she undertook became a testament to her belief that business success and social responsibility could coexist, that profit didn't require the exploitation of workers or the destruction of communities. Her renovation of the historic building had set the standard for everything that followed. Instead of rushing to maximize rental income, Maria had spent 18 months carefully restoring the structure's original architectural details while incorporating modern sustainable technologies. She had hired local artisans to recreate the building's ornate plasterwork, employed union electricians and plumbers for the infrastructure updates, and designed the office spaces to accommodate both established businesses and startups founded by immigrants and minorities. The building had become more than just a real estate investment, it had become a symbol of what was possible when development was guided by principles rather than pure profit. The ground floor housed a community center that offered free business training and legal services to aspiring entrepreneurs. The second floor contained affordable office spaces for nonprofit organizations working on social justice issues. The upper floors commanded premium rents from established companies that wanted to associate themselves with Maria's reputation for ethical business practices. Word of Maria's approach had spread throughout the real estate industry, attracting investors who shared her vision and contractors who appreciated her commitment to fair wages and safe working conditions. She had assembled a team of professionals who believed that business could be a force for positive change, and together they had built something that challenged every assumption about how real estate development was supposed to work. Carlos had graduated from the University of Washington with highest honors in engineering, but instead of immediately pursuing a corporate career, he had joined his sister's company as head of sustainable design. His expertise in green building technologies had become one of Rodriguez Development's signature advantages, allowing them to create structures that were not only beautiful and functional but also environmentally responsible. The company's projects had garnered national attention from architecture magazines, environmental groups, and business schools that used Maria's story as a case study in stakeholder capitalism. She had been invited to speak at conferences around the country, sharing her philosophy that businesses had an obligation to serve their communities rather than simply extracting value from them. But perhaps the most significant measure of Maria's success was the impact her work had on the people of Seattle. Rodriguez Development had created thousands of jobs that paid living wages and provided comprehensive benefits. Their residential projects had increased the supply of affordable housing without displacing existing communities. Their commercial developments had revitalized neighborhoods while preserving their unique character and supporting local businesses. Victoria Sterling had watched this transformation from the margins of a city that had once celebrated her as one of its most successful entrepreneurs. The intervening 7 years had been a steady descent into irrelevance and financial ruin. Her company had filed for bankruptcy 6 years ago, forced to liquidate its remaining assets to pay creditors and settle the numerous lawsuits that had accumulated during her fall from grace. The investigations triggered by the viral video had uncovered systematic fraud, tax evasion, and labor violations that had resulted in criminal charges. Victoria had avoided prison only by agreeing to a plea bargain that required her to pay millions in fines and restitution while accepting a lifetime ban from working in the construction or real estate industries in Washington state. Her personal fortune had evaporated in legal fees, penalties, and the collapse of her investment portfolio. The penthouse overlooking Elliott Bay had been sold to pay debts, along with her vacation homes, her art collection, and most of her jewelry. Victoria now lived in a modest apartment in a neighborhood she would have once considered beneath her notice, surviving on what remained of her savings and the occasional consulting fees from out-of-state clients who were unaware of her history. The social isolation had been perhaps more devastating than the financial losses. Victoria's former friends had abandoned her completely, unwilling to risk their own reputations by associating with someone who had become a symbol of corporate abuse and corruption. The exclusive clubs and charity boards that had once competed for her participation now refused to acknowledge her existence. She had gone from being one of Seattle's most visible and influential citizens to being a cautionary tale whispered about in the business community. The contrast between the two women's trajectories had not gone unnoticed by the media. Business journals regularly published articles about the rise of Rodriguez Development and the fall of Sterling Enterprises, often using their stories to illustrate broader themes about corporate responsibility and the changing expectations of modern consumers. Maria had become a symbol of ethical leadership and community engagement, while Victoria represented the outdated model of profit-maximizing capitalism that prioritized shareholder returns over stakeholder welfare. This morning, as Maria prepared for what would be the most important meeting of her career, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The young woman who had once knelt on Victoria's marble floor, forced to eat breadcrumbs while being recorded for the entertainment of cruel strangers, had become someone who could reshape entire neighborhoods and influence policy discussions at the highest levels of government. The meeting scheduled for 10 a.m. would bring together representatives from the Seattle City Council, the King County government, and several major developers to discuss the largest urban renewal project in the city's history. The waterfront redevelopment initiative would transform 50 acres of underutilized industrial land into a mixed-use community that combined affordable housing, commercial space, recreational facilities, and environmental restoration. The project had a budget of $1.2 billion and would create an estimated 15,000 jobs over the next decade. Rodriguez Development had been selected as the lead contractor for the project after a competitive bidding process that had lasted 18 months. Maria's proposal had emphasized community engagement, environmental sustainability, and economic opportunity for local residents. Her plan called for hiring workers from the surrounding neighborhoods, supporting minority-owned businesses as subcontractors, and designing the development to serve existing residents rather than displacing them. The selection of Rodriguez Development had been controversial in some circles, with critics arguing that Maria's company lacked the experience to manage such a large and complex project. Some established developers had complained that the city was prioritizing political correctness over practical considerations, choosing Rodriguez Development because of Maria's compelling personal story rather than her technical qualifications. But Maria had spent 7 years building the expertise and relationships necessary to take on exactly this kind of challenge. Her team included some of the most respected architects, engineers, and construction managers in the Pacific Northwest. Her financial partners included pension funds, insurance companies, and impact investors who were attracted to the project's combination of social benefits and economic returns. Her community outreach efforts had built strong support among neighborhood organizations, labor unions, and environmental groups. The morning of the meeting, Maria arrived at City Hall dressed in a navy blue suit that projected both professionalism and approachability. She carried a leather portfolio containing architectural renderings, financial projections, and letters of support from dozens of community organizations. Her presentation would lay out the vision for a development that would demonstrate how urban renewal could strengthen communities rather than destroying them. As she walked through the marble corridors of City Hall, Maria encountered several people who recognized her and offered words of encouragement. A janitor cleaning the floors stopped to shake her hand and thank her for creating good jobs with fair wages. A city council aide mentioned that her grandmother lived in one of Maria's affordable housing developments and was grateful for the sense of community that had been fostered there. These interactions reminded Maria of why she had chosen to build her career around serving others rather than simply accumulating wealth. Every project she undertook was ultimately about creating opportunities for people like herself, people who had been overlooked or exploited by the traditional power structures that dominated American business. The conference room was already full when Maria arrived, with representatives from government agencies, community organizations, environmental groups, and labor unions all taking their seats around a massive oak table that had witnessed countless decisions about the future of Seattle. Maria took her place at the head of the table, next to Mayor Patricia Williams, who had been one of her strongest supporters throughout the selection process. Mayor Williams opened the meeting by reviewing the history of the Waterfront Redevelopment Initiative and explaining why Rodriguez Development had been chosen to lead the project. She emphasized the city's commitment to ensuring that the development would benefit existing residents rather than displacing them, and she praised Maria's track record of delivering projects on time and under budget while maintaining the highest standards of social and environmental responsibility. Maria began her presentation by acknowledging the magnitude of the opportunity and the responsibility that came with it. She spoke about her vision for creating a development that would serve as a model for sustainable urban growth, one that would demonstrate how private enterprise and public purpose could work together to address the housing crisis, create economic opportunity, and protect the environment. The architectural renderings showed a community designed around human scale rather than automobile convenience, with tree-lined streets connecting residential buildings to schools, shops, and recreational facilities. The housing would include units affordable to families earning 30% of the area median income as well as market-rate apartments and condominiums for middle-class professionals. The commercial spaces would prioritize local businesses over national chains, with below-market rents for the first 5 years to help entrepreneurs establish themselves. The environmental features included green roofs, solar panels, rainwater collection systems, and native plant landscaping that would restore habitat for local wildlife. The development would be carbon neutral within 10 years of completion and would serve as a demonstration site for sustainable building technologies that could be replicated in other cities. Perhaps most importantly, the project would create pathways to economic mobility for residents of the surrounding neighborhoods. Rodriguez Development had committed to hiring at least 60% of construction workers from zip codes with high unemployment rates, providing apprenticeship programs that would give people skills they could use throughout their careers. Local contractors and suppliers would receive preferences in the bidding process, and the development would include business incubation space for entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. As Maria outlined these commitments, she could see the enthusiasm building around the table. Community representatives who had initially been skeptical of any large-scale development were nodding in approval. Labor leaders who had fought against previous gentrification projects were expressing support for an approach that prioritized good jobs and worker safety. Environmental advocates who had opposed other developments were praising the project's commitment to sustainability and habitat restoration. The questions that followed the presentation were substantive but supportive, focusing on implementation details rather than fundamental objections to the approach. Maria had anticipated most of the concerns and was able to provide detailed responses that demonstrated the depth of her team's preparation. She explained how they would prevent displacement of existing residents, how they would ensure that local businesses could afford the commercial rents, and how they would maintain environmental standards throughout the construction process. Near the end of the meeting, as Maria was discussing the timeline for breaking ground on the first phase of construction, the conference room door opened and a latecomer entered quietly. Maria glanced up from her notes and felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized the familiar figure of Victoria Sterling. Victoria looked smaller somehow than Maria remembered, her once commanding presence diminished by years of legal troubles and social isolation. She was dressed in an ill-fitting business suit that had clearly seen better days, and she carried herself with the careful posture of someone who was no longer certain of her welcome in rooms like this one. Mayor Williams looked surprised to see Victoria but gestured for her to take an empty seat near the back of the room. Several other attendees recognized Victoria as well, and Maria could see them whispering among themselves about what her presence might mean for the project. Victoria's arrival had shifted the energy in the room, creating an undercurrent of tension that hadn't existed moments before. Maria forced herself to continue with her presentation, but she was acutely aware of Victoria's presence and the symbolism of this moment. The woman who had once humiliated her in front of dinner party guests was now sitting in the back row while Maria commanded the attention of the most powerful people in Seattle. When the formal presentation ended and people began to mingle during the coffee break, Victoria approached Maria with the hesitant steps of someone who wasn't sure how she would be received. They faced each other for the first time in 7 years, two women whose lives had been shaped by a moment of cruelty that had ultimately led them to this unexpected reunion. "Congratulations," Victoria said quietly, her voice lacking the confident authority that Maria remembered. "You've built something remarkable here. Something I never could have imagined when." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence that would have acknowledged the circumstances of their last meaningful interaction. Maria studied Victoria's face, seeing the lines of stress and disappointment that had replaced the cold arrogance she remembered. "Thank you," Maria replied simply, choosing not to make this moment any more difficult than it already was for either of them. Victoria looked around the conference room, taking in the architectural renderings, the supportive faces of community leaders, and the obvious respect that everyone showed for Maria's vision and accomplishments. "I wanted to apologize," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what I did to you. For how I treated you. I know it's too late to change anything, but I needed you to know that I understand now how wrong I was." Maria felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to these words. Part of her felt vindicated, finally hearing the acknowledgement that she had deserved 10 years ago. But another part of her felt something unexpected, pity for the woman who had lost everything while learning lessons that should have been obvious from the beginning. "I appreciate you saying that," Maria said carefully. "But you should know that what happened between us 10 years ago is what brought me here. You taught me something important about myself and about what I was capable of achieving. In a strange way, I'm grateful for the lesson, even though I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone else." Victoria nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I spent 10 years thinking about that night, about the person I was, about the choices I made. I destroyed everything good in my life because I believed that power gave me the right to hurt people who couldn't fight back. I was wrong about everything." The conversation was interrupted by Mayor Williams, who approached to congratulate Maria on her presentation and to discuss the next steps in the approval process. Victoria stepped back, recognizing that she was no longer part of these conversations, no longer someone whose opinion mattered in decisions about Seattle's future. As the meeting concluded and people began to leave, Maria watched Victoria gather her things and head toward the exit. She found herself following, catching up with Victoria in the hallway outside the conference room. "Victoria," Maria called, causing the other woman to turn around with a startled expression. "I want you to know something," Maria continued. "The person you were 10 years ago doesn't have to be the person you are for the rest of your life. You've lost a lot, but you've also learned things that most wealthy people never have to face. Maybe there's a way to use those lessons to help other people avoid making the same mistakes you did." Victoria stared at her in confusion, not understanding what Maria was suggesting. "Rodriguez Development has a community outreach program," Maria explained. "We work with business schools and professional organizations to teach ethics and social responsibility. We could use someone who understands the consequences of prioritizing profit over people, someone who could share their story as a cautionary tale." The offer hung in the air between them, an unexpected bridge across 10 years of pain and transformation. Victoria's face showed a mixture of hope and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite process the possibility that Maria might be offering her a path toward redemption. "You would trust me to do that?" Victoria asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I would trust you to tell the truth about your experiences," Maria replied. "About the choices you made and the consequences you faced. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from people who have paid the highest price for their mistakes." Victoria nodded slowly, beginning to understand what Maria was proposing. It wouldn't restore her fortune or her social status, but it might give her a way to contribute something meaningful to the world, to ensure that her suffering hadn't been entirely pointless. As they parted ways in the hallway of City Hall, both women understood that this encounter represented a kind of completion. Maria had achieved everything she had dreamed of during those dark months of humiliation and struggle. She had built a business empire based on principles rather than exploitation, had gained the respect of her community and peers, and had created opportunities for thousands of people who might otherwise have been forgotten by the traditional economy. Victoria had lost everything she had once valued, but in losing it she had discovered truths about herself and about the world that might ultimately prove more valuable than money or status. The woman who had once forced a domestic worker to eat breadcrumbs off her floor had learned that true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The waterfront redevelopment initiative would break ground 6 months later, with Maria overseeing every aspect of the construction process to ensure that it lived up to the promises she had made. The project would become a model for sustainable urban development, attracting visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how cities could grow without destroying the communities that made them worth living in. Victoria would indeed join Rodriguez Development's outreach program, speaking at universities and professional conferences about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of ethical leadership. Her presentations would be powerful precisely because they came from someone who had experienced both the intoxication of absolute power and the devastation of its loss. In the end, both women had been transformed by their encounter 10 years earlier. Maria had learned that dignity was something that could never be taken away, only temporarily obscured by circumstances beyond her control. Victoria had learned that true success was measured not by what you could take from others, but by what you could give to them. The breadcrumbs that had once symbolized humiliation had become the seeds of transformation, growing into something beautiful and lasting that would benefit generations of people who would never know the story of how it all began. Sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives become the foundation upon which our greatest achievements are built, and sometimes the people who hurt us the most end up teaching us the most important lessons about who we are capable of becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.